Today we have an incredible panel. 4 crypto superstar lawyers who've joined us here today. We have Karin, Drew, Marc, Patrick. I want to give them the maximum amount of time to tell you their smart tidbits about crypto law in the 40 minutes or so that we have here for the session. So I'm going to let each of them do their rapid fire introduction. You should Google these people. You should look them up. 15 seconds is not going to give their biographies justice. Listen to what they have today to say. Look them up afterwards. Follow these people on Twitter. Add them on LinkedIn. These are people you want to hear from and find out more about. So, Karin, who are you?
Sorry, I didn't hear you.
I said, who are you, Karin?
Oh,
you want to give an overview to the audience?
Sorry, that's like technical issues. Who I am? I'm Karin. I'm a Zurich-based lawyer in Switzerland, and I'm in the crypto space for over, I would say, 4 or 5 years. 3 years ago, I was working for a bank, a Swiss private bank. It was the first bank who offered crypto assets to its client or to its clients, and I was in the driving seat of the legal and on the legal and regulatory side. So this was really a big achievement, and the rest, as you said, Addison, you can Google me, you can follow me on LinkedIn, and yeah, you will see what else I do as well.
And Drew, who are you?
Hi, my name's Andrew Hinkes. You can follow me on Twitter at @propelforward, no hyphens, dots, or dashes. I'm an attorney based out of Miami with Carleton Fields, and I'm also an adjunct professor who teaches a JD MBA class at New York University called Digital Currency, Blockchains, and the Future of Financial Services. It's a pleasure to be here.
Marc.
Hi, I'm Marc Boiron. I'm a partner at a law firm named Fisher Broyles. I've been in the space for about 4 years, 3.5, and helping clients kind of across the spectrum of issues in the crypto space.
And Patrick.
Hi, I'm Patrick Murk. I'm an affiliate with the Berkman Client Center at Harvard University. I'm also the CLO at Transparent Systems. I am on the FinTech Advisory Group, high-level FinTech Advisory Group for the IMF, and the FinTech Advisory Group for the New York Fed Reserve Bank. I've been involved in the space and digital currency and FinTech startups for about a decade now. And I've worn a number of different hats, from CEO, founder, to outside counsel, to investor. So pretty much tagged all the bases in startup land.
All right, well, thank you for joining us here today. And this panel is great because I've been told by the Cardano Summit that this does not have to mention Cardano, and this can just be what all 4 of you have to share with people of topics that are of interest to the public and in the news as well. So our first one that I want to hear from all of you about is CBDCs. So central bank digital currencies. These are the topic du jour. They are the sort of next stage in the conversation about stable coins, as well as a larger conversation about digital money. Cryptocurrency has been, of course, the main focus on digital money by lots of technologists, but it's a tiny corner of the world of digital money, of digital value transfer. But you 4 are experts on cryptocurrency, as well as what's going on in your respective financial systems in Switzerland and the United States. What do you think about CBDCs, or central bank digital currencies? Is this something that is the future? But more importantly, is this something that is going to be something that enhances people's privacy? Is this going to be something where we're able to incorporate anti-money laundering rules? Is this going to be a system where we can have it all? Or is this just all positives? Or are there some downsides here, this discussion? Patrick, why don't we start off with you? What do you think about this stuff?
It's all of that. No, that's not really an answer. Okay. But you know, as a lawyer, I'm trying to say it depends, right? And it definitely depends. It's going to depend on a few different things. Not every jurisdiction is going to weigh the balances between personal liberty and safety and soundness in the same way. So I think you will see some differences across jurisdictions in how CBDCs are approached. You're already seeing that happen. I look forward to hearing from Karin how Switzerland is looking at this. I'm more familiar with how the U.S. is looking at it. In the U.S., there are some competing proposals over how this can be rolled out, some of which look more like what we would think of as a CBDC. Some of it looks more like just a bank account at the Fed Reserve. And those design choices have some serious implications downstream for users. That's still very much a topic of conversation in the US, and hopefully one that we can continue to engage in. But I'll sort of like give space to others for their thoughts.
So you see this as continuing with the national systems that we have today, but into the digital world?
So I think that I think you can fall into the trap of thinking that this is a winner-take-all type of situation, and I don't think that's the case with money in general or payments. Typically, we see payment systems develop to serve certain communities. Now they can be larger or smaller. They can have more or less impact, and certainly a CBDC would have a huge impact and be a very large project here in the U.S. But that wouldn't necessarily mean that there would no longer be Fedwire for payments. There wouldn't be physical cash or things like that. So I don't think it's it's all going to be CBDC. It's more, is this going to be one new type of payment object and payment system, and is it useful?
And Karin, what's the Swiss perspective on this? Where do you think this would go?
I think personally that CBDC is very interesting, and that it could also contribute to the financial stability worldwide even, and I'll come back to that point, but I just want to explain how the Swiss landscape or regulatory landscape looks like. The Federal Council here in Switzerland looked at a project called the e-franc, so the e-Swiss franc, and the Federal Council report finds that as to the general public, the e-franc would not bring additional benefits to the country at large at the moment. So this was the outcome of the report. And according to that report, there are more risks related to the financial stability. I think the contrary is actually the fact. I think that the financial stability could actually be strengthened, meaning that, yeah, it's an interesting question. Different than book money or bank money, the e-franc or the CBDC is a functional currency, and it's like cash, and it's not book money or bank money. So the liquidity risk and credit risk moves actually away from the bank's balance sheet and so on, or other financial intermediaries. And that's something that I find quite interesting, yeah. It's not a legal topic, it's more an economic topic, but I find that really interesting. But the Swiss Stock Exchange, together with the Swiss National Bank, is currently working on the integration of a digital central bank money, which is DLT based, and which will be mainly used for making transactions of digital securities between financial services firms. So it's not, the e-franc the e-franc project was aborted, but on the Swiss National Bank / Swiss Stock Exchange level, there is a project going on.
So it sounds like that's not the end of the story for Switzerland.
Exactly, which is quite interesting, and I hope to somehow be involved as well in this project, so it's I can update you on this as well.
All right. Drew, how do you see this?
It's hard to follow up those two comments, but I'll try to share some other viewpoints. If we are to adopt a central bank issued digital currency in a country like America, we have to think about who are we doing this for? Who is the intended user? Is this to be an interbank transfer asset? Is this to be an asset that is supposed to supplement cash use or to replace cash use? And then we have to think about how are we going to get people to actually use this? So I think besides for sort of design issues that Patrick touched on and that Karin gave some insight as to how that's being thought of in Switzerland, we have to think about who's the intended user and what functionalities do they want. if this is intended to be a cash-like instrument, then there has to be some consideration as to whether people are going to want to use things that are different than cash for cash. For instance, should there be a database entry somewhere when I go to a coffee shop and buy a cup of coffee that shows the transaction and where that money came from? Do we want to have that sort of traceability? And if we have that sort of traceability baked into the instrument, who should be the keeper of that data? In the United States, we have a pretty robust constitutional scheme that protects our rights to privacy. And one of the really central issues involved in this debate is who is going to be the holder of data, because digital systems obviously create an audit trail that's materially different than if I'm handing a piece of paper to Karin or to Patrick. That doesn't necessarily create an audit trail. I'm of the view that if central banks want people to use this as the asset to replace cash, they need to radically rethink the way that privacy is done using digital assets, because very simply, I don't know that people are going to be satisfied with a really profound erosion of their privacy rights to transact.
It sounds like, from your perspective, that's what's going to happen. That's the current path.
I wish these people talked to me and shared their plans with me. I'm unfortunately a commentator on the sidelines, but my thought process is if
what do you think it should be?
Well, should it be? Again, it depends on what you're using it for. If it's an interbank settlement instrument, maybe privacy isn't really as important. If the issuance of the instrument is based upon something called the Chicago Plan, which is a idea of the Depression era, which said everybody basically has an account with the Fed and we all transact on the Fed's ledger, that has profound privacy implications. So we need to see what the proposals look like. The good news is I understand that the privacy issues are right front and center for these banks and for these governments. So we'll see what happens.
But also AML issues. And Mark.
Sure. So my thought process is actually very similar to Drew's, but I'll put it a little differently, which is, what's the goal of introducing a CBDC? If you think about it, if we were to go back, 100 years and have the current technology that we have, would we have a system that is structured the way that we currently do? I think many of the proposals are constrained by this concept that we need to have banks in between the Fed and the people. And the question is really, is that actually the right thing to do? I think that there can be privacy concerns regardless of how this is structured. And so, I think the first step is, okay, why don't we actually go to look at what would be the best way to get cash into the system? And cash really assumes that that's how, my view is the CBDC pretty much has to work as an equivalent of cash, because ultimately everything could be converted into cash. And so you essentially have to think that we could all be living just with cash. And so when you start from there, then the question is, okay, what do you do so that this system will actually get used if it's just like cash? I think there could be a system that could be created that respects people's privacy. The problem is, if you look at it from what is the current policy in the US regarding the use of cash, well, it isn't total privacy. Once you get to a certain amount, especially $10,000, you definitely do not have privacy anymore. And so we would actually have to rethink how we think about privacy in the context of money. And frankly, why would we do that? It's not a question of what I want. It's a question of we haven't been doing it because we've chosen that this is the best policy. So why would this cause us to rethink it? And I think the answer is it wouldn't, in which case then we would actually be in a worse spot, in my opinion, from a privacy perspective. But that doesn't need to be the answer. It's just the answer that I think we're going to head towards.
Financial surveillance seems like a fait accompli from the perspective of most of the proposals that I've read from central banks and other participants around the world. But it's interesting to hear all four of you talking about how this is an opportunity to think differently about things, an opportunity to pause and think about what we want for the future. So if I could give each of you 1 minute, where do you personally see this all four of you are quite familiar with market surveillance, financial surveillance, privacy interests, how payment systems work. If you had the chance, you've got 1 minute. Where do you think the balance lies here? Where would you like to see this go? Should we be looking at something more like the ancient system of cash, or something more like permanent digital records of every transaction? Patrick, where do you come down on this?
Drew, you sounded like you just had to get in there, so I'll give you space, man.
I was literally going to say, given his exposure to the people that are potentially having these discussions, Patrick's comments are probably going to be the most useful. I'll stay within the 1 minute and simply say that under the Fourth Amendment, we have this very strong protection in the United States as to our privacy. It's been substantially eroded by some judge-made law that basically says if you give information that somebody else uses for their business voluntarily without protecting yourself, you lose the warrant requirement protection over this. I want to see robust property rights and privacy rights protected in the US, and I hope that whoever is advising these governments and talking to them advocates strongly for the protection of some of these privacy rights. And now I'll pass my 10 seconds extra over to Patrick.
I think that privacy, like identity, is contextual. And I think that the best system will be one that recognizes the context and allows for a clear system of that people can so that people can understand what their rights are, who they are receiving privacy from and who they are not, whether it be transactional privacy between, say, me and Drew versus me and the government. So all that, I think, needs to be articulated clearly and understood by the people who are using it. I think that's the most important thing. And then if it's found to be deficient in some way, then we can address it. I think where we run into issues in the current system is where we have these systems where maybe they are where the line between de jure law and de facto law blurs, right? And we've seen that with Operation Choke Point and other things, where the lack of privacy and access has allowed for sort of a de facto process of excluding people from the economic and financial system. And so privacy is one way to safeguard against that, but it's not the only, right? And so it all depends on sort of the context here and making sure that it's clearly articulated and that people's voices are heard in the design process. And where it falls from there, like, I'm sort of just, maybe I'm too much of a nihilist. I don't know.
Well, Karin, you trained as a lawyer in a country famous for its record on privacy.
On
How do you feel about this?
banking secrecy, right? Well, I actually share your thoughts on privacy, or maybe I'm actually worried about privacy as well, because one major topic is really like AML, KYC, data protection, and these are major topics in Switzerland and in the EU. You might have heard of the GDPR, of the Data Protection Directive in the EU, and Switzerland has very similar or even equivalent provisions. They're very strict with regards to transmitting information, personal information and data. Data can only be transferred into countries that have equivalent data protection regulation and enforcement as the EU or Switzerland. And currently, US and China, for example, lack strong data protections from a EU perspective, which is a bit worrying, of course. And I'm not sure how this will work out because the whole system it's a global system, and it's like cross jurisdiction transactions and payments. So I'm not sure how like the data protection side will be covered, and if this actually hinders CBDCs or similar projects from really taking off. Yeah.
Thank you. And Mark.
So I think there's kind of two different strings that can be pulled here. there's the string of who is on each side of the transaction, and then there's the string of what is being transacted. And I think that there has to be a kind of decision made in terms of where we're going to strike the balance between those two strings, because the answer is not going to be, we can be sure of it, it's not going to be you don't know who's on the other side and you don't know what's transacted. That's not going to happen. So maybe it's situational, that you know that in certain situations you're going to know who has transacted. In other situations, you're going to know what has been transacted. I could very well see a system that basically says, you know, if you're transacting with any of, you know, X type business, I could very well see those businesses being registered and transactions being known with respect to those businesses. Something like that. I just, you know, what's ideal for me, I'd go further than that. But what's realistic and ideal is somewhere where one of those two things, one of those two strings are missing every time that there is a transfer. And when one or the other is missing is, to me, going to be the key kind of aspect of a system like this.
So it's really interesting. Like, I think that's a great way of like thinking about it. When I think of like these privacy issues and this transition to digital, before I did all this fintech stuff, I did some thoughts on, I wrote some thoughts on copyright. And so this transition strikes me as very similar to the digital transition from analog to digital in, say, the copyright sphere. There's something called in copyright the analog hole. I don't know if anybody's familiar with this. You have to be a kind of a copyright dork to really think about these things. But the analog hole, it was interesting. So when the iPhone moved away from having a headphone jack, the headphone jack is an analog hole in digital rights management software, right? If you stream music that has DRM attached to it as a digital file through your headphone jack, you can re-record it on the other side free of DRM. It's called an analog hole, right? You can defeat DRM through that. That's what physical cash is today. It's sort of the analog hole in the financial system. And, you know, there's a strong push to move away from physical cash to close that gap in financial surveillance. And it's understandable from a safety perspective and preventing illicit finance and other things. But there's a reason it's there. And I suspect that it won't actually be closed. Like that headphone jack, which is still actually on most Apple products today, I don't think it's actually going to go away completely. And it's also a way to look at the moment in time we're in and understand that this is the time to have the right conversation about what the quote unquote DRM on digital money is going to look like, right? And whose rights are preserved and what the balance is. So you won't have a chance 10 years from now to be involved in that conversation and get the balance right.
And will we see a merger of what you're talking about the cash and payment side of this with the cryptocurrency topic that I know is dear to all of your hearts? And this was part of our discussion before this talk about the crossover between central bank digital currencies and cryptocurrency. Obviously, cryptocurrency has been a part of the inspiration here. Is cryptocurrency more like an analog hole? Is it the cash part of this that we're going to be doing away with? Or is cryptocurrency something complementary to this?
Is there a future for cryptocurrency that isn't privacy preserving, that's an analog hole in a world that is full of CBDC and other really efficient payment instruments and payment objects, right? That's one way to think about it. And maybe there is, right? I mean, it's certainly not a monolithic market, but I think that there's definitely going to be a market for good or ill. It's just sort of the world we live in and the reality for those types of privacy preserving cryptocurrencies.
Opening the floor. Any of you have more to add?
I'll wade in. I think that the revolution that was started with Bitcoin and it's been extended across a whole bunch of other instruments that in large part behave the same way is significant, not because one architecture is measurably different than another. You know, like minds can disagree as to certain design choices, but I think the bigger picture here is that it creates a viable model, which is an alternative from state-controlled and state-determined money systems or value transfer systems. And if at some point nation states fall away, or for whatever reason, centralized control of economies by nation states no longer becomes relevant or desirable, here is an alternative that takes some of that control away from nation states and puts it in newer, different, much weirder places.
I want to follow up on what you said in a minute after we give Marc and Karin a chance to address this topic.
Yeah, so I think it really just depends on what a CBDC looks like. Right. So one thing that we all know is there's not enough people who care about their privacy, and that's just reality. They want what's easier, and in that world, where people who are going to decide, what a CBDC look like are going to be influenced by the world as a whole and what people as a whole care about. And then also layer on top of that the fact that the government loves to not let you maintain your privacy. You're looking at something that has a high likelihood of not having an analog hole built into it. And so then we start looking for alternatives. And obviously privacy coins are the kind of no-brainer alternative that exist. The question that I then have, though, is how useful are they? And you actually see this within the world of privacy coins right now, right? Depending on what method you use and who's using them, you can actually already basically determine who's on the other side of those transactions. They don't actually give you the privacy that you want. If we live in a world where CBDC is so easy to transact with and people don't care about the privacy, and then we suddenly just have this tiny world that lives within these privacy coins, I'm not sure that we'll actually get the level of privacy that we want even within those privacy coins. And so there's really this issue of the CBDC really being able to close the gap. And obviously you've got the power of government being able to tell people use this. And then people not caring. And so, I just think we're at risk of having a very small analog hole existing that might be created outside of the government. And by the way, Patrick, I absolutely love that term. It's just awesome. So thank you for introducing me to it.
Well, thank you, Marc. And Patrick, of course, for analog hole. But Karin, can you tell us about the Swiss perspective on this, where maybe some of these trade-offs are more recognized?
Not really. I mean, I absolutely agree with what Marc said. A lot of people, they don't care about privacy. They just give their information or data away as if it was nothing. And I really believe that information is very valuable and also dangerous to give it to certain persons or even to the state, to regulatory bodies and so on. I think it's also a matter of generations as well. I think especially here in Switzerland, older people or elderly people, I would say, they're not as tech savvy, of course, and they are very also resistant towards everything that is digitalized and so on. But the younger generation is totally different. And I think the younger generation will for sure use CBDC because it facilitates the way they transact, they move money from A to B or whatever, send money. And I think that this will be a generational matter as well. And maybe CBDC will not be as popular for the older generation, but for the younger for sure. Because if you compare or look at how the younger generation acts on social media and what they disclose, they don't really think about like data privacy as much as like the older generation, I would say. So I think if the state, as Marc said, facilitates payments, people will jump on it. That's my assumption and my prediction.
I hear 4 experts at the top of their field, all concerned about privacy, but also not thinking that things are going to change. Is it maybe that we lack the tools? Do we need a new doctrine for financial privacy? Is there something to learn from crypto in informing us? Do we need new legal doctrines here? Or are the existing systems and rules capable of change?
So my view is that they are capable of change. The question is whether there is the desire for change, and maybe that's really what you mean. But ultimately, look, we've had the privilege in the U.S. of yeah, there's your ups and the downs in the U.S., but nobody's ever felt. I mean, I guess some would argue now maybe they do, but really threatened by the government in any way whatsoever in terms of going off the rails. And because of that kind of lack of history, really US people I don't think they care about that, because they're like, I live in a country that has this constitution that, is, very well thought out. I don't have to worry about anything. But reality is that, the constitutions continue to be encroached on, over the years. I don't see why that would stop. And, there's a lot of other, if you look back at history, there's probably a lot of civilizations where you had, everything looking fine and dandy until one day you've got a leader that steps in and says, this is how it's going to be. And suddenly everybody says, oh, why is it that I can't make decisions on my own? Why can't I hide from this or that? And so, how do you remind people that is a possibility anywhere? Yes, it's a possibility that might take 20 years to play out or 30 years to play out, but it is a possibility that is very real. And I'm just not, I don't personally see a way of making kind of the frankly average person who doesn't already think about that realize that, at least in the US. I just don't see it.
So you don't see a need for a new legal doctrine, but if people want to change, it's public opinion change that you think is
sure
the area to focus on. Is that a fair summary?
I agree with that 100%.
Drew?
Mark made a nice reference to Pax Americana, the whole idea that we've had such relative success and stability that people haven't really noticed their rights slowly eroding. People started to notice when the Patriot Act was introduced, and they've paid more attention, I think, in the social media era, given that the amount of data that's being produced and the type of data being produced is materially different than what was being produced and tracked before. So I think that we are becoming more aware, at least in the US, about the implications of data tracking and the privacy implications of this new sort of computerized era that we live in. I think that we have all the tools necessary. I believe that it's a matter of policy. It's, do the decision makers in the legislative and judicial branch want to see a world where we have this more freewheeling, more liquid, less restrained kind of financial transaction? We have made a bunch of policy decisions that say we're going to track value as a way of fighting crime. And that is something that has been adopted globally. And it has been, some would say, successful. There's really, two different views on that. But unless or until those sorts of policies fall out of favor and we adopt a different viewpoint, I don't really see that changing. We can sort of mold the contours of that policy. We can shift the policy around a bit, but I think it's here at least for a while.
Yeah, I think that everybody's points are excellent, and Drew, I think you hit the nail on the head there at the end. I guess what I could add to this conversation is just that one path forward is to, and I think in a lot of these conversations, they tend to gravitate to the polls, right? And one, it's either all privacy or no privacy, right? And that's on both sides, both from the people who are staunch, like we must stomp out all illicit finance, to people who are like, the government should never see anything I'm ever doing, ever, right, under any circumstances. But there is, most people, I think, are obviously in the middle here, right? There is illicit finance, and we do want to have controls in place. We don't want to have a completely freewheeling system, I think, right? For anybody to do anything, right? So there has to be some sort of control. The path forward, I think, is if you look at the Bank Secrecy Act in the US in particular, if you look at the Bank Secrecy Act and how it's actually implemented, I think there's a growing, small but growing sort of consensus forming that the way we're doing it today is not helpful for anybody, right? That it's not succeeding on a, just in terms of a rough cost benefit analysis in preventing enough illicit finance for the lack of inclusion that and the cost and the burden it places on financial intermediaries. And on the other hand, it's very invasive in terms of financial privacy, and it does it through the private sector where you have less rights and less control. And so I think there's an opportunity, again, there's sort of a window of opportunity to try and come up with solutions that allow for control for both in terms of when your privacy can be diminished, right? When there's cause to do so, and when you can preserve your own privacy and be back in control of your own privacy. And I think that the technological tools aren't quite there, but they're getting there, right? Where you can see technology meeting sort of a new consensus on how we strike this balance. And I think that is like a path forward. So practically speaking, if you're developing one of these systems, you know, think like a regulator, right? Think like somebody who cares about these issues deeply and say, how can I control some elements of like the worst aspects of this system, right? How can I provide tools so that law enforcement can actually prevent these really bad behaviors that could happen, right?
Thank you, Patrick. Well, 3 minutes left. Sorry, I'm going to have to interrupt you. All four of you, this could be 2 hours with each of you, and I feel terrible about cutting all of you off of your wonderful comments here. But with 3 minutes left, can I hear from the four of you your closing remarks on this? And I know I don't have 2 hours here for you, but Karin, closing thoughts?
Yeah, I just wanted to add something to the previous conversation and maybe just ask a counter question. Isn't it also about education, like educating people about their rights and about what data privacy is? I mean,
Great
that's
question to end on. Mark.
No, I think that's right. The educational aspect is actually very important. My concern. So I'm a huge skeptic on educating people on privacy because there's this trade-off always: privacy, security, and ease. And frankly, people are lazy. Like humans, we're lazy people. We don't want things to be hard, and so you can educate all you want, and people are going to say, I just want to do this easier thing because it's not going to happen to me. And so that's really, to me, that's the issue. And I think education should be done no matter what, because you can't just fall down and say, we give up. It's not going to work. But I just don't think that we can spend, that it's going to work, frankly. I think it's a question of really, to Drew's point, like a policy decision that needs to be made. I just don't see how it's made favorably when you've got a majority of people who don't care. But I guess we'll see.
Yeah, because the follow-up question would be, who would educate people then, right? I mean, who would do it? Yes.
You four. Drew?
I'll zoom this back out to the more macro question, which is, privacy and digital money. I think digital money, especially if it's government issued, is a great opportunity for us to rethink exchange overall. We have the potential to create new structures. We have the potential to make new policies. We can create things that will have gross societal benefit. We can deal with privacy in creative ways. We can rethink how we interact with each other. And I think that it's a powerful concept. And my hope is that all the smart folks out there, and maybe all the smart folks on this chat as well, give it some thought and give it some time. I think this may be a rare opportunity where a technology world has a say in how their society functions. And I think that we should not look past the importance of that opportunity.
And Patrick, closing words.
Yeah, I would underscore all the things from education to the skepticism around it and the rare opportunity. I would say that a lot of these concerns can be addressed and we can strike the right balance if we're involving the right people and the right communities in the design process from the beginning. And if I have a concern about where things are going, it's that we are not being inclusive in the design process of these systems. And I would really, really want to underline the importance of that, right? That giving people the power to solve their own problems is the most effective way to come up with systems that work for everybody.
Thank you very much, all four of you. This has been very insightful. I've learned something from listening to you four. This talk is pre-recorded the day before the Cardano Summit, and I'm hoping right after this we're going to have live Q&A so that the audience can hear some more and chat as well. I'm hoping this can be participatory. Thank you very much, Drew, Karin, Marc, and Patrick for joining us today.